Eleanor stood in that silent church, accused of murder. But the real monsters weren't in a jail cell. They were sitting in the front pew, smiling at her. Every single eye in Sweetwater Ridge was pinned on her, 1,000 tiny daggers of judgment. Outside, the Texas sun baked the world to a crisp. But in here, the only thing you could feel was the ice-cold chill of condemnation. Sheriff William Grimby's voice boomed through the silence, his badge glinting like a single, cruel star. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, the name sounding like a curse, "you stand accused of conspiracy in the death of your husband, Robert Harrison, Jr. How do you plead?" Eleanor didn't flinch. Her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles were white, but her voice, when it came, was as clear as a church bell on a cold morning. She looked past the sheriff, past the rows of whispering townsfolk, and straight into the eyes of the Harrison family. Samuel Harrison, the patriarch, a man who owned the whole county and everyone in it, stared back, his face flushed with a fury he barely bothered to hide. Beside him, his wife Martha's eyes glittered with a pure, unadulterated hatred. "The truth," Eleanor said, her voice ringing out to every corner of the packed church, "cannot forever remain hidden in darkness." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "That is not an answer to the charge," Sheriff Grimby snapped, his patience wearing thin. A small, cold smile touched Eleanor's lips. "No, it is not," she agreed. "But perhaps before I answer, the good people of Sweetwater Ridge deserve to hear a story." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suffocating silence. "A story that began 2 years ago. A story about a woman who discovered that the greatest threat to her life wasn't the Texas wilderness, but the very family she had married into. 2 years earlier, the sun had barely kissed the horizon, but Harrison Manor was already a place of shadows." Eleanor moved down the long, creaking hallway like a ghost, the only time she could truly breathe, being these precious moments before the rest of the house awoke. She was a widow, a tolerated burden. Her husband, Robert, had been dead for 2 years, and in all that time, her in-laws had never let her forget her failure. Her failure to produce an heir, her failure to keep their son alive. The library was her only sanctuary, a place filled with books and silence, a place her father-in-law, Samuel, considered a harmless hobby for a woman with too much time on her hands. But as she reached for the door this morning, a voice cut through the stillness like a shard of glass. "You're up early again, Eleanor." It was Martha Harrison, her mother-in-law, standing rigid and severe, already dressed in her perpetual mourning black. It wasn't just a dress, it was an accusation she wore every single day. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison," Eleanor said, her voice practiced and polite. "I thought to read a little." Martha's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "Always with your nose in those books? It's unnatural. Perhaps if you had spent more time attending to your wifely duties, my Robert might still be alive." The words were small, precise cuts. Eleanor was used to them. She had learned to bleed internally where no one could see. "My husband wishes to speak with you after breakfast," Martha said, her eyes raking over Eleanor with cold disapproval. "In his study." And just like that, the sanctuary of the morning was shattered. A summons to Samuel's study was never a good thing. It meant a verdict had been reached. A punishment was about to be delivered. Breakfast was a silent, suffocating ritual. Samuel Harrison sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, a king presiding over a barren kingdom. He was a man carved from granite and greed, his piercing blue eyes missing nothing. He spoke of business, of ranches acquired and debts collected. He was building an empire, a legacy. The word hung in the air like a hangman's noose. A legacy Eleanor had failed to provide. Then his calculating gaze slid to her. "I've been in correspondence with Dr. Caldwell," he said, his voice deceptively casual, "at St. Mary's Institute in San Antonio." Eleanor's fork froze halfway to her lips. St. Mary's. The name alone sent a spike of pure terror through her heart. It wasn't a hospital. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones. A place where inconvenient wives and difficult daughters were sent. A place from which many women never returned. "It's an excellent facility," Martha added, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "They've had remarkable success treating women of delicate constitution." Eleanor carefully placed her fork on her plate. Her appetite, and any hope she had for the day, had vanished. I was not aware, she said, her voice shaking almost imperceptibly, that I was in need of treatment. Samuel's eyes narrowed. It has been 2 years since Robert's passing. Your melancholy grows concerning. The servants report you cry out in your sleep. Most disturbing, her nightmares. They were using her private grief as a weapon against her. Someone had been listening at her door, reporting her every tear, her every whispered memory of Robert. The house wasn't just a home, it was a prison, and its walls had ears. I assure you, I am in perfect health, she said, her hands clenched in her lap. That is not for you to determine, Samuel replied, his tone final. Arrangements have been made. You will depart for St. Mary's at the end of the month. Dr. Caldwell specializes in cases like yours, women who cannot accept their proper place. The room tilted. 1 month. She had 1 month before they locked her away forever, before they silenced her, before they took control of the small inheritance from her parents, the only thing that was truly hers. And my belongings, she whispered, already knowing the answer. They will be held in trust, of course, Martha said with a predatory smile, until such time as you are deemed recovered, if that day should ever come. If, not when, if. The word was a death sentence. May I be excused? She asked, her voice a hollow echo of itself. Samuel nodded, already dismissing her, already turning back to his wife to discuss the price of cattle. As Eleanor fled the dining room, her legs unsteady, one thought screamed through her mind. This wasn't about her grief. This wasn't about her health. This was about control, and she had just 1 month to find a way out before they buried her alive. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling Harrison ranch, a kingdom built on dust and determination. Eleanor made her way to the stables, the one place she still felt a connection to her late husband. Robert had loved it here, a refuge from the oppressive formality of the main house. It was also where she had found him, sprawled in the hay, his face a mask of agony, his body already cold. They called it a riding accident, a tragic fall from his favorite mare. But Robert had been one of the finest horsemen in Texas, and he'd been found inside the stable. The details had never quite added up, but in the fog of grief, she had accepted the official story. Now she wasn't so sure. Now everything the Harrisons said seemed like a carefully constructed lie. Ma'am? A lanky stable hand named Timothy watched her with worried eyes. Mr. Harrison said you weren't to ride on account of your delicate health. Of course, another freedom, another small piece of herself, quietly stripped away. The walls of her prison were closing in, brick by suffocating brick. I just wanted to see Willow, she said, her voice soft. She was Robert's favorite. The boy hesitated, then nodded. I suppose that'd be all right, ma'am. Eleanor stood by the mare's stall, stroking the horse's velvety nose, the simple, honest presence of the animal a balm to her frayed nerves. You miss him too, don't you? She whispered. She was lost in thought, remembering the strange shift in Robert in the months before he died. The secrecy, the long, unexplained rides, the way he looked at her sometimes as if he wanted to tell her something, but couldn't find the words. You look like you're saying goodbye, ma'am. The voice came from behind her, deep and steady. She turned, startled, to see a man leaning against a post in the shadows. He was tall, dressed in the worn clothes of a working horseman, not a Harrison ranch hand, a stranger. He stepped forward, removing his hat. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the color of a gathering storm. Forgive me, he said, his voice a low rumble. Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Ethan Riverstone. I brought the horses Mr. Harrison purchased. You'd be Mrs. Harrison then, he said, his gaze direct, without the pity she was so used to. Robert's widow. Yes, she replied, surprised by his frankness. He nodded slowly. Thought as much. Robert spoke of you. Before she could ask how this stranger knew her husband, the stable door banged open. Prudence, the housekeeper and Martha's loyal stooge, stormed in. There you are, she snapped, her eyes landing on Ethan with undisguised contempt. Socializing with the help. Mr. Harrison is asking for you. Immediately. Prudence practically dragged her from the stables, hissing about propriety and the shame of a widow speaking to a man like Ethan Riverstone. But Eleanor's mind was racing. He knew Robert. He had known her husband. And for the first time in 2 years, a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Samuel Harrison's study was the heart of his empire. A dark wood-paneled room that smelled of leather, whiskey, and absolute power. He was standing at the window staring out at the land he owned when Eleanor entered. He didn't turn. "I received a letter today," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "From your sister, Catherine." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Catherine, her only living relative, was her lifeline. They wrote to each other through a trusted friend in town, the minister's wife, a precaution Eleanor had taken, knowing the Harrisons monitored her every move. "She didn't write to me," Samuel said, turning from the window. He held up a sheet of paper. "This was addressed to you, a response, it seems, to your concerns, your suspicions regarding Robert's death." He had intercepted her mail. He had violated the last private corner of her life. "Your sister expresses alarm at your paranoid fantasies," Samuel read, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She urges you to accept the truth of Robert's tragic accident. She seems quite concerned about your mental state." It was a lie, a forgery. Catherine would never write those words. Her sister believed her, supported her. This was another brick in the wall they were building around her, another piece of evidence to justify sending her to St. Mary's. "May I see the letter?" she asked, her voice a thin thread. "That won't be necessary," Samuel said, tossing it onto his desk. "What is necessary is for you to understand your situation, your delusions, your inappropriate conversation with that horse trader. It all confirms what Martha and I have concluded. You are unwell, Eleanor. Dangerously so." "I am perfectly well," she shot back, desperation making her bold. "Robert's death was a tragic accident," he thundered, his composure finally cracking. "My son was thrown by his horse. These wild theories of yours are an insult to his memory." He took a deep breath, regaining control. His voice softened into something that sounded almost like kindness, but felt like the coiling of a snake. "I understand your grief. That is why St. Mary's is the only solution. There, you will receive the care you need. And you will receive control of my inheritance," she said, the words quiet but sharp. Samuel's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Your impertinence only confirms our decision. Your movements will be restricted. You will not leave the house. Your meals will be taken in your room." "This is not a punishment, Eleanor," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "It is for your own good." The door clicked shut, sealing her fate. She was a prisoner. Her time had run out. St. Mary's wasn't a month away anymore. She could feel it. It was coming for her, and it was coming soon. The days that followed were a suffocating blur. Eleanor was confined to her room, with the hawk-faced Prudence as her personal jailer, sleeping in an adjoining room with the door left open. Her books were taken away. Her letters went unanswered. She was completely, utterly isolated. Her only respite was a brief, supervised walk in the garden with Martha. During one of these silent, tense strolls, she saw commotion at the stables. New horses were being unloaded. The horses Ethan Riverstone had delivered. "The horse trader," she said, trying to sound casual. "Mr. Riverstone, has he departed?" Martha's eyes narrowed. "He completes his business today. Samuel has no further need of him. Why do you ask?" "Simple curiosity," Eleanor lied. Martha made a disapproving sound. "Men like that are drifters. Decent women do not notice them, let alone inquire after them." But Eleanor had noticed. She couldn't forget the steady confidence in his storm-colored eyes. He had known Robert. That was a thread, however thin, and she had to pull it. Suddenly, shouting erupted from the stables. Men's voices raised in anger. Martha stiffened. "Wait here," she commanded, and strode off toward the disturbance, her curiosity overriding her duty as Eleanor's warden. The maid who trailed them also drifted toward the noise, drawn by the drama. For a single heart-stopping moment, Eleanor was unobserved. It was now or never. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped through the rose garden, circling around toward the back of the stables. The shouting grew louder. She found a side door to the tack room and slipped inside. The smell of leather and saddle soap thickened the air. Peeking through an inner doorway, she saw a scene that made her blood run cold. Samuel Harrison stood, rigid with fury, facing Ethan Riverstone. Between them, looking terrified, was Timothy, the young stable hand. "I will not tolerate thievery on my property," Samuel snarled. "The penalty for horse theft is hanging, boy." "I didn't steal nothing," Timothy cried, his voice cracking. "I was just exercising the new mare." "The boy's telling the truth, son," Ethan cut in, his voice calm and steady, despite a fresh bruise forming on his jaw. "I saw him. He was following orders." Samuel turned his venomous glare on Ethan. "This is none of your concern, Riverstone. Your business here is concluded." "Seems to me," Ethan replied, not backing down an inch, "that seeing an innocent boy accused of a crime he didn't commit is every decent man's concern." The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Samuel Harrison was not a man who was used to being contradicted, especially not on his own land, and especially not by a man he considered his inferior. Eleanor knew she had to do something. If she let Samuel's rage run its course, young Timothy could hang for a crime he didn't commit. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the shadows. "Mr. Harrison," she called out, her voice clear and firm, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Every head whipped in her direction. Samuel stared at her, stunned into silence by her audacity. "I was here earlier," she said, walking forward with a confidence she didn't feel. "Timothy," she said, turning to the boy, "didn't you tell me that Mr. Peterson, the foreman, instructed you to exercise the new horses?" Hope flared in the boy's eyes. "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what he said." "There you have it," she said, turning back to Samuel. "A simple misunderstanding." Samuel's gaze flickered between Eleanor and Ethan, his eyes dark with suspicion. "You two seem remarkably aligned in your concern for a stable boy." Just then, Martha burst into the stables. "Eleanor! What are you doing? I told you to wait!" Her eyes took in the scene, Samuel's rage, Ethan's calm defiance, and Eleanor's unprecedented interference. Martha's face hardened. This was an opportunity. "Your behavior grows more erratic by the day," Martha snapped, her voice triumphant. "This impulsive interference only confirms what we've been saying. You are unstable." Eleanor felt a chill creep down her spine. Her attempt to do the right thing had played directly into their hands. They would twist this, use it as further proof that she was losing her mind. "Mrs. Harrison was simply clarifying a situation," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Seems to me that speaks to a clear mind, not an erratic one." Martha shot him a look that could freeze fire. "No one asked for your assessment, Mr. Riverstone. As my husband said, your business here is concluded." Ethan tipped his hat, a gesture that was both polite and profoundly dismissive. As he walked past Eleanor, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. An unspoken message passed between them, a recognition, a promise. Then he was gone. Eleanor was left to face the full fury of the Harrisons. "This incident," Samuel said, his voice cold as the grave, "has confirmed the necessity of our decision. You will return to your room. Your departure for St. Mary's will be moved forward. I will make the arrangements immediately." Her blood turned to ice. Not a month, not a week. It was happening now. As Martha gripped her arm, leading her away like a prisoner, Eleanor knew her time had run out. Her desperate gamble had failed. The walls were closing in for the final time. That night, Eleanor sat in her room, a prisoner under the watchful eye and snoring ear of Prudence. The house was silent, a tomb sealed by the weight of Samuel Harrison's will. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating a blank sheet of paper on her writing desk. They had given her permission to write to her sister, one last time, one last chance to incriminate herself with her delusions. What could she write? That she was sane? That her husband was murdered? It would only be twisted into another symptom of her madness. Tap, tap. The sound was so soft she thought she'd imagined it. A branch against the glass. Tap, 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 more insistent this time. She crept to the window, her heart pounding. Down below, standing in the deep shadow of an old oak tree, was a figure. The moonlight caught his face. Ethan Riverstone. Her heart nearly stopped. She glanced at the open door to Prudence's room. The rhythmic snoring was undisturbed. Moving like a wraith, she unlatched the window and eased it open. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Came to check on you." His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying on the night air. "Heard talk in town about you being sent away. Didn't sit right with me. This man, this virtual stranger, had risked his life trespassing on Harrison land for her." "It's true," she admitted, her voice trembling. "St. Mary's. They're sending me as soon as they can." She saw his expression harden in the moonlight. "That place isn't a hospital, Mrs. Harrison. It's a place where inconvenient women disappear." "I know," she whispered, "but I have nowhere to go." He was silent for a long moment, and then he said the two words that would change everything. "Come with me." The offer hung in the night air, impossibly tempting, impossibly dangerous. "What?" "I'm offering you a way out," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Tonight, before they can take you." "But why? You barely know me." A shadow passed over his features. "I knew your husband, and I made him a promise." "A promise." The word echoed in the darkness, filled with secrets she didn't have time to unravel. "If I'm caught—" "You won't be," he said with quiet confidence. "I know these grounds. I know the patrols. I know a way out that no one watches." Freedom. It was right there, a hand reaching for her in the darkness. But the cost. To flee in the night with a man she didn't know? Her reputation would be destroyed. She'd be a ruined woman. "You'd be alive," he said simply, as if reading her mind. "And free. Seems to me that's worth more than a reputation." He was right. What good was a flawless reputation to a woman locked in a cage? "When?" she asked, her decision made in a single, heart-stopping beat. "Now," he said. "Pack what you can carry. Be quick, and be quiet." She moved through the moonlit room in a blur, her hands shaking as she grabbed a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the few things that were truly hers. She scribbled a single line on the paper on her desk. "I go of my own free will. Let them wonder." At the window, she passed her small bundle down to Ethan. Then she hesitated, looking back at the room that had been her prison. As if sensing her doubt, Ethan's voice drifted up, soft but firm. "Eleanor, Robert wouldn't have wanted this for you. He wouldn't have wanted you trapped." He used her given name, and he spoke of Robert with a certainty that broke through her final wall of fear. She gathered her skirts and climbed through the window. His strong hands closed around her waist, guiding her safely to the ground. "Stay close," he murmured. Together they melted into the shadows, moving silently across the grounds of the enemy. With every step she took away from Harrison Manor, Eleanor felt a wild, terrifying, and glorious sense of freedom. She was no longer the broken widow. She was a woman who had just declared war. They rode through the night, the moon their only guide. By the time the sun bled across the horizon, they were miles away, hidden in a small creek bed. Eleanor's body ached from hours in the saddle, but it was a good pain, an honest pain, the pain of escape. As Ethan tended to the horses, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind all night. "The promise," she said. "What promise did you make to Robert?" Ethan's shoulders tensed. He finished checking the horse's leg before turning to face her, his expression grim. "To look out for you," he said simply, "if anything happened to him." A shiver went down Eleanor's spine. He thought something might happen? "He was more than concerned," Ethan said, his voice low and serious. "He was afraid. He told me things at the ranch weren't what they seemed, that he'd discovered something, something that put him in danger." "What did he discover?" she pressed, leaning forward, her exhaustion forgotten. "He didn't say in detail. He was careful, but it had to do with land deals, with the way his father was expanding the Harrison holdings." Eleanor's mind flashed back to hushed conversations she'd overheard. Properties bought for a fraction of their worth. Families suddenly ruined. forced to sell land that had been in their name for generations. Robert was looking into those sales, Ethan continued, his storm-colored eyes dark with memory. He said he found evidence. Forgery. Fraud. Maybe worse. And then he died, she whispered, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a riding accident, was it? No, Ethan said. It wasn't. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her husband, the man she had lived with, the man she had mourned, had been murdered. And the people responsible were his own family. We need to find out what he knew, Ethan said, his voice firm. For his sake, and for yours. Because if they were willing to kill their own son to protect their secrets, what do you think they'll do to you? The question hung between them, cold and sharp. She had escaped the manor, but she hadn't escaped the danger. She was a loose end, a witness, and Samuel Harrison did not tolerate loose ends. Where are we going? She asked, her voice small. I have a place, he said. A cabin. It's safe. No one will find you there. He paused, his gaze steady and unwavering. There's someone there you need to meet. Someone else who knew Robert's secrets. The cabin was nestled so deep in the woods it felt like a secret the world had forgotten. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a welcome sight after another full day of hard riding. As they approached, the door opened. An elderly woman emerged, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her silver hair in a long, neat braid. She stood with a quiet dignity that seemed as old as the trees around her. Ethan, she said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Her dark, intelligent eyes moved from him to Eleanor, and it felt as if she were seeing not just a tired woman, but every fear and hope Eleanor carried inside her. Morning, Dove, Ethan said, a deep respect in his voice. This is Eleanor Harrison, Robert's widow. I know who she is, Morning Dove said, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's. The signs told me you would come, and that you would not come alone. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of drying herbs and wood smoke. Morning Dove served them a simple, savory stew that warmed Eleanor from the inside out. As they ate, Eleanor felt the older woman's quiet, assessing gaze on her. You have questions, Morning Dove said after they finished. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. About the man you married, about his death. Yes, Eleanor admitted. Instead of answering, Morning Dove rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. From it, she withdrew a leather-bound journal. Eleanor gasped. She recognized the worn cover, the precise feel of it. Robert's diary, she breathed. I looked for it everywhere after he died. It was gone. He gave it to me, Morning Dove explained, placing the journal in Eleanor's trembling hands. For safekeeping, 3 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, it was to go to you, but only when you were free from his father's house. Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest. It was a piece of him, a final message sent from beyond the grave. The answers you seek, Morning Dove said softly. Begin there. Her hands shaking, Eleanor opened the journal. Robert's neat, familiar handwriting filled the page. She began to read, and with every word, the world she thought she knew began to crumble. The journal wasn't just a diary, it was an investigation. Page after page detailed Samuel Harrison's ruthless acquisition of land. But it wasn't just shrewd business. It was a pattern of terror, threats, blackmail, and worse. Robert had chronicled it all. Wilson found dead in his barn. Sheriff ruled it a suicide. 3 days after, he refused to sell his north pasture to father. Convenient. The Miller family's well poisoned. Their cattle died. They were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar. It was a litany of horror. But then, Eleanor turned a page and saw a hand-drawn map. It showed a path, a corridor of land cutting straight through the county, connecting all the properties Samuel had so brutally acquired. A railroad, she whispered, looking up at Ethan and Morning Dove, her eyes wide with shock. He knew where the new railroad was going to be built. He was buying up the land before anyone else knew its true value. Not just buying it, Ethan said grimly, stealing it. The scale of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Samuel wasn't just a greedy rancher. He was a criminal mastermind, colluding with corrupt officials to build an empire on the ruins of other people's lives. But that wasn't the worst of it. The entries in the journal grew more frantic, more fearful, in the weeks leading up to Robert's death. I have found the proof, the original letters between Father and Judge Whitfield. He can't deny it now. I have to confront him. I cannot let this stand. And then the final terrifying entry, written in a shaky hand just 2 days before he was found in the stables. Something is wrong. The tremors in my hands are worse. Father served me a private glass of whiskey tonight. A toast, he said, to the family's future. It tasted strange. I fear I have been a fool. I fear it is already too late. Poison. They hadn't just murdered him. They had poisoned him slowly, deliberately, watching him weaken day by day. The riding accident was a lie to cover the true monstrous nature of their crime. Eleanor felt sick. The man she had mourned as the victim of a tragic accident had been a casualty of war. A war fought in his own home, against his own father. St. Mary's, she said, the pieces locking into place. It wasn't just about my inheritance. They wanted to silence me. They were afraid of what I might have seen, what Robert might have told me. Exactly, Ethan said. You weren't just an inconvenience. You were a threat. But as she stared at the last page of the journal, another, even more disturbing thought began to form. Robert had written that he'd hidden the proof. The most damning evidence, the letters from the judge. He'd written, I've hidden them where only someone who knows the truth about my mother would look. His mother? Eleanor looked at Morning Dove confused. But Martha... Morning Dove shook her head slowly. Martha was his stepmother, she said, her voice soft but heavy with old secrets. His birth mother was named Rebecca. She died when Robert was just a boy. Ethan's face was grim. Officially, it was an accident, a fall from a cliff. There were no witnesses, except for Samuel, and a 10-year-old Robert. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of horror. You think Samuel... Robert believed so, Ethan said. He was haunted by the memory, his mother's fear, his father's rage, and then her body on the rocks below. When he uncovered what his father was capable of with the railroad, he started to believe that his mother's death wasn't an accident at all. Samuel Harrison hadn't just killed his son, he had killed his wife too. He was a monster who eliminated anyone who stood in his way, and Robert had found the proof. Proof that was still, right now, hidden somewhere inside Harrison Manor. There is something else you should know, Morning Dove said, her dark eyes filled with a deep compassion. A different lie they told you, about your body. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? The story they told you, Morning Dove said gently, that you were barren, that you could not have children. It was not true. The words hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, the shame she had carried for years, the endless, silent accusations in Martha's eyes, the belief that she was flawed, broken. It had all been a lie. But the doctors, she stammered. Doctors who owed Samuel Harrison favors, Ethan cut in, his voice tight with anger. Robert discovered it. Samuel arranged it all before you were even married. He needed to ensure that any lack of an heir was seen as your fault. It was another way to control you, to break you. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. Tears of grief, of rage, of a profound sense of loss for a future that had been stolen from her. They hadn't just tried to take her freedom and her sanity. They had taken her hope. They had taken the family she and Robert could have had. That was the moment the last of her fear burned away, replaced by something cold, hard, and unbreakable. She closed the journal. We have to go back, she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. She looked from Ethan to Morning Dove, her eyes blazing with a new, terrible purpose. We have to go back to Harrison Manor. We have to find that proof, and we are going to burn Samuel Harrison's empire to the ground. The plan was insane, a suicide mission, but it was the only path forward. They traveled to Dallas, a city of dust and ambition, to meet the one man Robert had trusted outside of his secret circle, a lawyer named Nolan Sullivan. They met in the back parlor of a discreet boarding house. Sullivan was a sharp, cautious man, his eyes assessing Eleanor and Ethan from behind wire-rimmed spectacles. But when they told him their story, when they showed him Robert's journal, his caution turned to cold fury. I knew Robert was concerned, Sullivan said, his voice tight. He sent me a package of documents 6 months before he died. Land deeds, witness statements. But he stared at the journal. This is murder. He confirmed what they suspected. The evidence Robert had sent him was damning, but it was circumstantial. Without the proof Robert had hidden, the letters from the judge, Samuel Harrison's wealth and influence could likely weather the storm. He hid it in a place connected to his mother, Rebecca, Eleanor explained, a place his father would never think to look. She told them about the locked room in the east wing of the manor. The room Prudence had told her was the first Mrs. Harrison's old painting studio, sealed since her death. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. The annual cattle auction in San Antonio was in 3 days. Samuel and Martha never missed it. It was their prime social and business event of the year. For 1 week, they and most of their senior staff would be gone. It was their only window. Returning to the manor is madness, Sullivan warned. Samuel will have doubled the guards. But the house will be on a skeleton staff, Eleanor countered. And I know its routines, its blind spots. I know how to get in. They needed a cover story, a reason to be near Sweetwater Ridge without raising alarm. And Eleanor knew just the thing. A rumor, a spark of fear. A fever outbreak, she said. There were cases in the next county over. If word got out that it was spreading, people would panic. A visiting nurse checking on outlying properties. No one would look too closely. The final piece fell into place when Sullivan revealed that Dr. Howard Mitchell, the town doctor from Sweetwater Ridge, was in Dallas for a conference. Mitchell was a good man, one of the few who had shown Eleanor genuine kindness, and who harbored his own doubts about Robert's accident. They met with him the next morning. When he heard a carefully edited version of the truth, that Eleanor was escaping mistreatment and needed to retrieve personal documents, he didn't hesitate. He not only agreed to help, but he provided them with the perfect tool. Robert gave this to me about a month before he died, Dr. Mitchell said, pressing a small, ornate silver key into Eleanor's hand. He said if anything happened to him, I was to make sure you got it, but only after you were away from the manor. He said it was connected to his mother's legacy. The key to the locked room. Robert had planned for this. He had laid a trail for her to follow. While Eleanor and Sullivan prepared in Dallas, Ethan rode out to gather his own resources. He returned on the 3rd day, meeting them on the North Road to Sweetwater Ridge. With him were 2 men, Thomas Jenkins and Miguel Vasquez. They were quiet, capable men whose loyalty to Ethan was absolute. The team was assembled. The hunter was returning to the lion's den. The night was moonless, a perfect blanket of darkness draped over the Texas landscape. Harrison Manor loomed ahead of them, a hulking shadow against the stars, its windows dark and silent. Jenkins and Vasquez melded into the trees, circling the perimeter to watch for patrols. Dr. Mitchell waited with the carriage on a deserted service road, ready for a fast escape. Eleanor, Ethan, and Sullivan crept through the overgrown gardens toward the east wing. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, a smell Eleanor now associated with fear. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. They reached the secondary entrance, a small, rarely used door half hidden by ivy. The guard Ethan had predicted would be there was slumped in his chair, a bottle of whiskey loose in his hand, fast asleep. They slipped past him and into the silent house. The east wing was still and dusty, smelling of disuse. They moved down the hallway, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpets. They found the door to the painting studio at the end of the corridor, just as Eleanor remembered. It was locked, just as she knew it would be. She pulled the silver key from her pocket. It slid into the lock with a soft, metallic whisper. She held her breath, turned the key, and heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Click. The lock disengaged. Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a room frozen in time. A dusty easel stood in the center, a half-finished canvas of a Texas sunset still resting on it. Jars of dried-up paint and stiff brushes littered a nearby table. The air was thick with the faint, ghostly scent of turpentine and oil paint. It was a shrine, a tomb. Samuel had locked the door on his first wife's life and never looked back. Where would he hide it? Sullivan whispered, his eyes scanning the room. Somewhere his father would never look, Eleanor murmured, thinking back to Robert's words. Somewhere connected to his mother. Her eyes fell upon the canvas on the easel. The sunset. It was beautiful, but unremarkable. She walked closer, her instincts screaming at her. She ran her fingers along the heavy wooden frame. It was ornate, far too heavy for such a simple painting. And then she saw it, a tiny, almost invisible seam along the bottom edge of the frame. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. He was beside her in an instant. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully pried at the seam. It gave way, revealing that the bottom of the frame was a cleverly disguised hidden drawer. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted them out. She unwrapped the bundle. On top was a letter, written in a delicate, feminine hand. "My dearest Robert," it began. "If you are reading this, it means your father has finally done what I have long feared, and I am gone. Do not believe the stories he will tell you. He is a monster, a man of profound cruelty and greed." It was a letter from Rebecca, a final message to her son, hidden for years. Beneath it was her personal journal. Page after page documented Samuel's rage, his violence, his obsession with wealth and power. She wrote of her plans to escape, to take Robert and flee to her family in Dallas. And then, tucked inside the final pages of Rebecca's journal, was the ultimate proof. The original, unaltered land deeds for the properties Samuel had stolen. And beside them, the forged deeds he had used to secure them. It was undeniable proof of massive fraud. But that wasn't all. Tucked into the very back of the oilcloth bundle was a small, corked vial containing a dark, viscous liquid. Attached to it was a small yellowed note, written in Rebecca's hand. He calls it his special reserve. A gift from a chemist in New Orleans. Tasteless, odorless. Works slowly, mimicking a wasting sickness. I found it in his study. I fear what he plans to use it for. The poison. The same poison that had killed Robert. Samuel hadn't just acquired it for his son. He'd had it for decades. Maybe he had even considered using it on his first wife. They had it all. The motive. The method. The proof. Suddenly a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. They froze, their blood turning to ice. A sliver of light appeared under the door, growing brighter. Someone was coming. A lantern. They were trapped. "Out the window!" Ethan hissed, moving toward the large casement that overlooked the gardens. He worked the latch, but it was rusted shut, frozen from years of disuse. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. The handle began to turn. There was no way out. This was the end. The door swung open and Eleanor stared into the face of her enemy. But it wasn't Samuel. It wasn't Martha. It was Prudence, the housekeeper, her face a pale, ghostly mask in the lantern light. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. The three intruders, the open drawer in the frame, the papers in Eleanor's hand. For a heart-stopping second, no one moved. Prudence opened her mouth to scream. "Don't," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady. She held up Rebecca's journal. "Before you raise the alarm, Prudence, there's something you should know. Something about the man you've served so loyally." Prudence hesitated, her mouth still open. The scream caught in her throat. "Samuel Harrison murdered his first wife," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with the absolute certainty of truth. "He poisoned his own son. It's all here. The proof." A strange, broken sound escaped Prudence's lips. It wasn't a scream. It was a sob. "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "I've always known." She looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with 2 decades of fear and guilt. "He saw me that night, the night Rebecca died. I was a young maid. I saw him push her. He's held it over my head ever since. My silence, in exchange for my life." The loyal stooge wasn't loyal at all. She was another prisoner, trapped in the same house, under the same tyrant. "Help us," Eleanor said, her voice softening. "Help us, and you can be free too." Prudence looked at the papers in Eleanor's hand, then at the door, then back at Eleanor. After a lifetime of fear, a flicker of defiance sparked in her eyes. She nodded. "The West Cellar," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a tunnel. It leads out to the old ice house by the creek. It's how the bootleggers used to move whiskey during Prohibition. Samuel doesn't know about it." She led them through the sleeping house, her lantern guiding the way down a set of narrow, winding stairs to the dark, damp cellar. She pulled aside a heavy wine rack, revealing a rough-hewn wooden door hidden in the stone wall. "Go," she said, "and Godspeed. Make him pay for what he did to her, to Rebecca." They fled through the tunnel, emerging into the cool night air, hundreds of yards from the house. They made it to the carriage, to Dr. Mitchell, and galloped away into the darkness, leaving Harrison Manor and its dark secrets behind them for the last time. They didn't stop riding until they reached Dallas. The trial was the talk of Texas. It didn't take place in the small church in Sweetwater Ridge, but in the grand courthouse in Dallas, where Samuel Harrison's influence couldn't reach the judge and jury. Eleanor Rose Blackwood, she had dropped the Harrison name for good, took the stand. She didn't speak as an accused woman, but as a witness. With Nolan Sullivan beside her, she presented the evidence, piece by damning piece. Rebecca's journal was read aloud, her words echoing from the grave, painting a portrait of a terrifying monster. The forged deeds were displayed, irrefutable proof of his criminal empire. The vial of poison sat on the evidence table, a silent testament to his ultimate sin. And then Prudence took the stand. In a quiet, trembling voice that grew stronger with every word, she told the court what she had seen all those years ago. Samuel Harrison, in a fit of rage, pushing his wife from the cliff's edge. When it was all over, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty, on all counts. Samuel Harrison, the king of Sweetwater Ridge, was sentenced to hang. His empire crumbled. The lands he had stolen were returned to their rightful owners or their surviving family members. Martha, disgraced and penniless, disappeared, swallowed by the same society she had so desperately tried to dominate. Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps, the Texas sun warm on her face. She was free, truly free. She had her inheritance, and she used a portion of it to create a fund to help the family Samuel had ruined. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a quiet, steady comfort. Their journey through darkness had forged a bond between them, deeper than either had expected. What the future held for them was a story yet to be written. But for the first time, Eleanor felt that any future was possible. She had walked into that church an accused woman, a broken widow. But she walked out of the courthouse as the woman she was always meant to be. Strong, resilient, unbreakable. She had faced the monsters in the front pew and had won. If you enjoyed this story of hidden truths and justice finally served, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next tale we uncover from the shadows.